What's up, everyone? Nayman here, and it's time for another monthly Modern Meta Breakdown. This time, we're going to be talking about Burn. Alright, so if this is your first time tuning in for our Modern Meta Breakdown videos, here's how this is going to work. We're going to go through the cards that are in the deck, kind of talk about how they synergize well together, what you might be expecting to see when you're playing this deck or playing against this deck. There are a couple of cards that are scrolling above me. Those are a couple of key cards that are unique to the deck that might be different depending on what colored version of the deck you're running. Because of course you could just run a mono red version of the deck, or you could run the Boros Burn, which is probably the most popular version of Burn and one of the strongest versions. Now, Burn is one of the more budget-friendly decks that exist in Modern. If you're familiar with Modern, you know that some decks can be extremely expensive, especially because of the land base, where the Burn side of things, the lands are of course the most expensive cards in there, with the exception of one creature that hasn't really gotten many reprints, and we'll get into that and talk about that, because the creature base that are in Burn lists are pretty much the same. You're going to see more or less the same 12 creatures that exist. Every now and again people will try out things like Ragavan or things like that to spice it up a little bit, but the traditional versions of Burn run about 12 creatures, and it's pretty much these same creatures that you see time and time again. The rest of the list is dedicated to burn spells, hence the name Burn Deck. So we'll talk about why these cards are in here and why there might be certain numbers. There are a few flex spots that exist within the list itself that we'll kind of talk about which those flex spots are and where you might be able to slot in other cards that you might enjoy, adjust numbers accordingly, that sort of stuff. But let's get into at least talking about the creatures that are in here. So we have the tried and true Goblin Guide that exists. It is of course our 1-drop, 1 red for a 2/2 creature with haste, and the way it worked back in the day is that if creatures would be printed as 2 power, 2 toughness for 1 mana, there would usually have to be a downside. For the longest time there wouldn't be these super powerful things. So the way to do that is saying, hey, this creature, when it decides to attack, depending to player, reveals their top card, and if it's a land, it adds it to their hand. It's actually not so much of a downside as much of, hey, you get information. What's on top of your opponent's library? Are they having a land? Is it a spell that you have to be worried about? Is it a creature you need to be worried about? Because the fact that we get haste, we're getting in for 2 damage immediately, is really, really strong. A lot of turn 1 plays are going to revolve around having a 1-drop. So Goblin Guide, Monastery, Swift Spear, that sort of thing. It's nice to have Swift Spear usually on turn 2, so you could be able to drop that down and play a spell, and we'll talk about why that is, because Swift Spear does have that prowess ability. So again, another 1-drop. It's a 1/2 with haste. Prowess, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn. And we are running so many non-creature spells that we should be triggering that prowess very, very quickly. So our idea is to get a Goblin Guide, a Monetary Swift Spear out within the first 2 turns and start swinging sideways with them. We're keeping pressure on the ground, swinging at our opponents, while also getting all these spells in our back pocket that we can whip out and start flinging at my opponent's face. The goal is to get them low enough that when we resolve an Eidolon, that they're basically locked out of the game. Now, how does this work? Because Eidolon is whenever a player casts a spell that includes ourselves. If we are playing the Burn deck and we're starting to throw burn spells, we are also taking damage. But we're weakening our opponent enough that this is going to prevent them or force them to say, hey, you're going to have to spend a lot more resources in your life total to get rid of this card and be in a good spot for us to finish them off with burn spells. But Eidolon, whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, this creature deals 2 damage to that player. So again, weaken with some creatures. Eidolon is a later play. We don't want to be dropping Eidolon early if we can help it, because it's, again, could get removed early. Our hope is to get it out there where it becomes challenging for opponents to be able to get rid of. But the main part of the deck is having all of our burn spells. Now, a lot of players like to joke about how burn is not a strategy-based deck. It's a very straightforward deck that you have to just be like, dump your hand and hope for the best, which I'm here to tell you that is not the case. If you've ever piloted a burn deck, you will know that it is very much a game of a kind of a tightrope walk that you have to be walking here, of how much your decisions matter, because there are going to be games where you get very close to killing your opponent, where they might be at 1, 2, 3 life, and a split-second decision that you made during that game could have prevented you from winning. It could have been that you decided to bolt a creature instead of bolting face 2 turns ago, right? So these little nuances or decisions. Oh, I decided to keep my Goblin Guide back on defense to block instead of attacking with it. So these nuances that you start to learn when you play the deck are really going to come to the forefront. But the idea is, yes, you're dumping your hand, you're trying to dome them so much with so many different burn spells. 28 different spells are in here. Now, all of them except for 4, so 24 spells total, are dealing 3 damage. Right? If someone only has 20 life, you don't need that many spells to be able to kill someone. Our Boros Charm is the only spell that we are running right now that does 4 damage, and that only does damage to a player. It cannot deal damage to a creature. Back in the day, there used to be some things where people would try to protect themselves with a Spellskite. I'll pay 2 life to redirect it to Spellskite. Well, you've paid 2 life, but it does not redirect to Spellskite because it cannot actually target the Spellskite. So now you've just taken 6 damage. And that's like one of those learning moments for a lot of players. But the traditional stuff that we would normally see, Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt, right? These kind of 1-drop spells that are coming in here that are just straight, deal 3 damage, right? 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker, perfect. That's going right to face. That's not going to be changing. Lightning Bolt, 3 damage to any target. Creatures, players, planeswalkers, doesn't really matter. Again, we're mainly going to be using that to hit face, but occasionally you will have to adjust accordingly and bolt creatures with that one. Searing Blaze does have to target a creature, so there are specific choices in that regard, right? For 2 red, Searing Blaze will deal 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to target creature that players control. You have to be able to have both those targets available in order to cast this spell, so there needs to be a creature, and you need to be able to target your opponent's creature, because if you're targeting one of your creatures, it's not gonna, then you're taking the damage. But it's got that landfall ability in here. So if you have a land enter the battlefield, it's going to be dealing 3 damage instead. So that's why we see this list in particular has access to 8 fetch lands to help with our landfall triggers to be able to get this, and why this list is running 4 Searing Blaze, where sometimes that falls out of favor a little bit. Sometimes that number gets adjusted. So that kind of fits within our quote-unquote flex spots. Searing Blaze, Skullcrack, Boros Charm, Lightning Helix, those are those flex spots where you might see slight adjustments in numbers within those spells. On some are running 4, some are running 3, some are running 2. You're never going to see one-ofs of those spells. It's always going to be within that 4, 3, 2, and just some slight variations on what the meta is looking like, right? We might need to run more Skullcrack depending on if there's more life gain related stuff in there, right? Like Uro and things like that, you know, hey, we need more ways to kind of negate that life gain. So Searing Blaze is in there. Again, landfall triggers matter for it. So let's highlight a little bit more of our kind of flex spots. What are you talking about? We talked about Boros Charm, Skullcrack. We were just talking about players can't gain life this turn. Again, it's not as relevant currently in the current meta, but it does, you know, have an effect in there that we need to make note of. Also, you're just dealing 3 damage. So we're trying to use as many 1-drop 3 damage spells as possible, right? Chain things together, cast as much as we can, get as many prowess triggers as we can to get our Swift Spheres to be very big and scary. Push in, get a lot of damage done. We're also going to have a couple of 2-drop spells like Skullcrack. All right, Searing Blaze, here's 3 more damage. Just more redundancy within the deck is kind of the name of the game. We're going to continue up with that sort of plan. But again, that number can fluctuate 2, 3, depending on how you've been at. I haven't really seen people run more than 3 with all the burn spells that are out there. Years ago, you might run 4, but that was before different things. Like Skewer the Critics made a big difference in that. So Helix is the other flex spot. Life gain is relevant because we are racing. The name of the game is a race. I'm going to race and burn you down quicker than you're able to kill me and stop me from burning you. Players are fetching, they're shocking, they're doing things to kind of adjust their life totals that it might be a little bit easier. You are doing all that as well. You're fetching, you're shocking, you're being able to use your lands to tap to gain access to red mana, because we have ways to sacrifice and draw cards off our lands, which we'll get into when we get to the land base. So the extra 3 life that we gain can be relevant. That's another one of those flex spots where it might adjust our numbers. But worth noting, and the main reason we're running Boros for this burn version is Lightning Helix and Boros Charm. The other 1-drop besides Lava Spike and Lightning Bolt is Skewer the Critics and Rift Bolt. Skewer the Critics does have that Speculate. So if we've already dealt damage, let's make sure we can keep seeing that. If we've already dealt damage, you can cast this spell for 1 red. Otherwise, we have to pay 3 mana to do it. Not as useful if we're having to spend 3, but sometimes we will. Sometimes we're going to have to top deck it. We have no creatures on board to push that, but we need another 3 drop or another 3 damage. That's why Skewer the Critics is in here. The likelihood that we're going to hit Speculate is pretty good, though. Rift Bolt is in here. Rift Bolt's a great one, and works well if you have a Rift Bolt. Ties in well with Swift Spear, right? Because you can sit here and suspend it. Okay, I'll pay a red, suspend this. Next turn, I'm coming for you. Get ready. It's going to be hitting you for 3. Or you can pay 3 mana and just hit someone for 3. It's kind of like the Skewer the Critics. You have those alternative costs to being able to use them, but it's still the same kind of idea. Lava Spike and Lightning Bolt. I'm dealing 3 damage, but Rift Bolt is kind of that hope that we have a Goblin Guide, hope that we have a Swift Spear, hope that we have a Rift Bolt is like kind of the ideal consistent turn 1 play. Lava Spikes, Lightning Bolts, right? We have so many 1-drops in here that we should be dealing 3 damage, well, 1, 2, or 3 damage on turn 1, guaranteed. If your hand does not have the ability to deal that damage for some reason, then you better mulligan that hand, because it's not going to help you. So that's kind of the way it goes. There are some nuances with this deck, like I talked about, by who you're playing against, the decks that you're playing against, and when you might have to pivot a little bit. But for the most part, it's about going face and being able to calculate out when to push for extra damage and find those lines. Just like any deck in Modern, you have to be able to start practicing with it, and it's hard to get into the specific nuances without playing it for you guys on stream or anything like that, which we're not in gameplays at the moment, but it might be something in the future if people are interested in. Let's highlight the land base quickly, go to sideboard quickly, and then we're done with it. So we talked about there are fetch lands, Arid Mesa, Wooded Foothills, that sort of stuff. The other thing, we have like the fast land Inspiring Vantage is in here, but the Sunbaked Canyon and the Fiery Islet are the 2 to note, right? We had these new Pain lands, Horizon lands, the ones that allow you to pay 1 mana, sack it, draw a card. Because there are going to be periods where we are running 20 lands, which is a small number of lands when it comes to it, but there are points where our hands have a bunch of creatures or a bunch of lands, and we're missing out on a couple more burn spells to chain together to kill somebody. Maybe we're getting flooded a little bit, so having that access to draw, which is not something we had before the kind of Modern Horizon style came out and allowed us to get these, so it does add that little nuance in there, but something to note that we do have draw built into our deck now. Sideboard, Boros does give us access to some of the best white cards that we can hope for. You can see things like Path to the Exile to deal with more creatures, Core Firewalker if we're playing against kind of a mirror matchup, Protection from Red. Whenever a player casts a red spell, you gain 1 life. Also helps if we need a little bit more life gain, because we are casting red spells or gaining life off that. Deflecting Palm is an amazing card. I love it every time I see it. Deflect the damage from one source right back at somebody. So if your opponent is going for that kind of big creature, maybe like a Murktide Reagent, you can just say, hey, now that's hitting you in the face. So I love Deflecting Palm. Roiling Vortex is in here, just kind of constant damage. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, this deals 1 damage to each player. So it's including yourself, so it kind of speeds up our clock. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast this, then Rolling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. Now there are spells, of course, that you can cast for free. I'm talking about some kind of blue counter spells, so there's 4 of in here for some shenanigans like that. Smash to Smithereens, anti-artifact cards that we've got, because every deck needs anti-artifact cards in there. We also should have some graveyard hate. At this point, it's not a big deal. We're kind of mainly relying on what we've got: more burn, more creature removal. But Smash Smithereens, again, it's modern. You have to have artifact removal. And this one also deals 3 damage as well, so it's definitely worth it. Exquisite Firecraft is pretty cool, dealing 4 damage. It does have that spell mastery there, so it can't be countered. 3 cost for 4. It's more expensive, but again, redundancy is kind of how we need to go about things. If you're playing against a blue deck that has a lot of counter magic, having this to just guaranteed 4 damage is pretty nice, and that's kind of why it's in there. But, you know, what do you guys think about Burn as a deck? Do you like playing against it? Are you annoyed playing against it? How much skill do you think it actually involves? Have you piloted it before? Because I know that it is a very skill-intensive deck, like most of the decks are in Modern. But that's going to do it for this episode. If you guys liked it, please hit those follows, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you guys haven't checked out all of our other links, you can down below. We've got, of course, our stream where we're putting up Magic content and real-time strategy content for StarCraft, Age of Empires, all that kind of fun stuff. But yeah, again, there'll be new episodes coming out. We've got 2 every single month, 1 for Modern, 1 for Commander, and then every now and then we'll sprinkle in an extra one here and there. But that's going to do it for us today, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in and watching, and I'll see you guys